Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, why is there food on the outskirts of this temple? Who is it for? Is it an offering to a Buddha?
The food is for Pretas. They're starving creatures, and just as the temple seeks to alleviate all suffering caused by desire in humans and animals, they also seek to alleviate it in Pretas and in demons.
Why do they starve?
They have tiny mouths with narrow throats, but large distended bellies that can never be filled. When they drink water, it is like fire to them. They can rarely eat any food, and when they do, it either turns to dust in their mouths or it catches in their narrow throats and they choke.
What a horrific existence. What did they do to earn that?
In a past life, they were likely very gluttonous. They frequently succumbed to the passions of desire, and now they must exist without ever knowing satiation.
What an ironic and cruel recompense.
Hello and welcome to Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing Pretas. What are Pretas in Buddhism? What is their status in the canon? How ought we understand them? I hope you enjoy.
So let's get in. What are Pretas in Buddhism?
These are creatures in South and East Asian religion that actually change quite a bit over time. Preta is a Sanskrit name that refers to the inhabitants of the realm of hungry ghosts, which you remember is one of the 6 or the 10 realms of transmigration. The Pretas are very interesting creatures because they come up in a variety of religious traditions, including Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and Tibetan, Indian, and Chinese folk religions. The Sanskrit term Preta originally means departed or deceased or a dead person, and it comes from prayita, literally gone forth or departed. Because of this, in classical Sanskrit and in earlier pre-Buddhist Indian traditions, the term actually totally refers to the spirit of any person who has just died, but especially before the memorial and the funerary rites are performed for that person. However, this term can also more narrowly refer to a ghost or an evil being. A Preta in its earliest context is somebody who has gone forth but still lingers around for some reason. Usually, the reason is that the bereaved have not done the proper rituals of obeisance to placate them. As such, there is little to no connotation of the Pretas as being starving until a bit later in history. In this earlier conception, the idea was to incentivize ancestor worship and placation. If you neglect the proper rituals to send your deceased loved one on their way to the next life, then they will come back and bother you in increasingly inconvenient and disruptive ways. When they have just passed away, the idea is that they are peacefully waiting. When more time passes without a memorial or a funerary ritual, they start to interfere with your daily life in a bothersome way. Appliances will stop working, or you won't be able to find your keys, or your food will go bad early. Then, if even more time passes, things will get even worse and even more inconvenient and disruptive. Maybe you'll become severely depressed, or your house will catch on fire. Pests will get into your crops. Then, if even more time goes by and the whole community is neglecting their ritual duties, then it could mean the decimation of the entire community by means of famine, drought, pestilence, illness, and more. Entire traditions of ritual, entire classics of literature, and entire aspects of culture are determined by how a community relates with their dead. If they're disposed of and forgotten, their past role in the development of the community in the present is forgotten and disrespected, and thus those who have passed on are angered. If they are respected and placated, however, then the community won't forget the importance of those who came before as long as the rituals continue, and in turn, those who have passed on as spirits will protect and assist in the success of the community even after death. We will see that Preta's description changes over time as they are partially translated from Indian culture to Chinese and Tibetan culture. When this shift happens, an almost entirely new type of creature comes about, and the Pretas become creatures with far more specific and particular circumstances and characteristics. As this change occurs, the Pretas are typically depicted as being invisible to the human eye unless you have achieved certain meditative attainments, and when these Pretas are visible, they're small creatures with mummified skin, distended bellies, and long, thin limbs and necks. They are said to be undergoing much more intense suffering than humans, and this manifests as them being incredibly hungry and thirsty, but unable to have their desires satiated. In this newer iteration of the interpretation of Pretas, there is the idea that you can become one by having bad karma, and that being one of these is not only the result of being neglected after death, but is also a cosmic punishment, or a karmic punishment, for a gluttonous life. Before this, we had the idea that all people who died were Pretas until determined otherwise by the actions of the living, not the actions of the person who passed on. Next, we have the idea that whether or not somebody becomes a Preta after death is not related to rituals after death, but entirely based on the actions of the deceased during their life. We all still have ritual obligations to them for the sake of compassion and mercy, but the idea is that only some people who die become a Preta. As Buddhism develops and changes all throughout Asia, we will see how these ideas change and adapt and localize to different cultures. In this historically newer iteration of the Pretas, they are said to live in deserts and in wastelands and in places of death, and they're said to go through constant heat or cold. They also live in solitude or in groups, and they're free to move about in space. This is what distinguishes them from hell dwellers living in the lowest of the 6 realms of transmigration. Hell dwellers, or demons, which we will talk about in the next episode, are confined to a specific subterranean hell realm where they live. In Mahayana Buddhism in particular, we all still have ritual obligations to the Pretas out of compassion and mercy. There will often be food left out on the outskirts of a temple complex for the hungry ghosts, for example. Also, as I mentioned, many of the rituals that take place after somebody dies are about preventing them from becoming hungry ghosts. These rituals are usually for merit transfer, where offerings are made to the Buddha for the sake of increasing the good karma of the deceased, or they are ordained pre- or post-mortem into a temple. Also in China, Cambodia, Tibet, Thailand, Singapore, Japan, and Malaysia, there are festivals which are aimed at placating the hungry ghosts, or otherwise remedying their suffering in some way. These are very enjoyable and fun festivals to observe and learn about, and they are each unique in their own ways. But they share in their purpose of bringing the community together to do something to try and remedy the suffering of those who have passed on.
What is the status of Pretas in the canon?
According to the tradition, evil deeds that lead to becoming a hungry ghost include killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. Desire, greed, anger, and ignorance are all factors in causing a soul to be reborn as a hungry ghost, because they are motives for people to perform evil deeds. However, beyond that, we should mention that there is not much more detailed about them in the sutras. The role that Pretas play in Buddhism is a matter of death rituals, and that is one of the things in Buddhism that changes and localizes the most as Buddhism travels across East Asia. Naturally, it's one of the 6 or 10 realms of migration, but there are no named Pretas in the canon. The Pretas are not named or active characters in the sutras. They're rarely, if ever, present when the Buddha is teaching. Certain disciples of the Buddha are known for going to preach to the hungry ghosts on occasion, but the Pretas themselves are side characters in that process. Quick aside, I've always had this issue with savior stories in Buddhism. Bodhisattvas are supposed to have no concept of self, such that their acts of generosity and compassion are truly selfless. Giving alms or showing compassion or saving a being just because it makes your circumstances better is the wrong kind of giving and the wrong kind of saving. However, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are pretty self-aggrandizing in text when they talk about how they are so enlightened and so compassionate, and the suffering of the Pretas or other beings sort of props them up in those stories. It seems contradictory, and it reminds me that these stories are written by human beings, and their natures find their way into the texts. In the canon itself, Pretas can be saved, and they are saved by preaching to them, doing rituals for them, and giving offerings to them. This is important because there are not always clear pathways to saving other kinds of beings in the canon, such as animals or demons. I'll get into this more when we talk about how to understand them, but the Pretas represent a type of sentient being which is very familiar and readily present to human experience across a wide variety of cultures. They're personalized in that they are our deceased loved ones. They're small creatures whose suffering is so much higher than ours, but whose past sins are not so egregious as the demons, such that they elicit a lot of compassion from us. And they are easy to save, in that they don't need much from us in order to make their suffering better. Regardless, we should come back and mention that Pretas are not terribly prevalent or important or active in the texts. There are different ideas about how one becomes a Preta, as we have mentioned, and those interpretations commonly come up in commentary texts, but those texts are usually more about how to understand the Pretas in the scheme of a particular interpretation of the teachings, rather than what the Preta's actual status is in that scheme.
How ought we understand Pretas?
The Pretas are interesting in that they predate Buddhism in India, but also in China and Tibet. As I mentioned, they are folk religious figures prevalent in many different traditions. In this, they are more than an imported creature like a deva or an ashura. They're very present to everyday people regardless of how close or distant they are to Hindu or Buddhist orthodoxy. In parts of China and in Korea and Japan, this idea I brought up of spirits, of those who have passed on and who have been forgotten and neglected by the living becoming real nuisances on the community, becomes very prevalent characteristic of Pretas in folklore. It makes these Pretas fascinating mythological and legendary creatures. You might have heard of creatures called yokai in Japanese folklore. There are even animated television shows like Yokai Watch, and there are countless manga and anime and stuff where yokai are prevalent characters. The consensus is that these yokai came about as personifications of unexplainable events, like a serious run of bad luck, or a sudden depressive episode, or the sudden failure of technology or tools around you. The idea is that if that stuff happens to a person at a rate that beats random chance, then there must be a possession, or a parasitism, or some other sort of antagonistic relationship going on between the person it's all happening to and the yokai in question. This could be a yokai with a personal vendetta, or it could just be a random yokai. In Korea and in Japan both, there were and are well-established traditions of shamanism and exorcism aimed at solving these problems in the community. When Buddhism arrived in these cultures, it syncretized and localized with those traditions, and the role of yokai was aligned with the role of the Pretas. As such, there are continuities between the older interpretation of the Pretas and the newer ones that I mentioned before. In a more cultural scope, rather than in the scope of orthodoxy, Pretas incentivize remembrance and relationship with the dead, building on existing traditions of ancestor worship and ritual. There is a Japanese historian of Buddhism out there who I have read a couple of times for various courses, named Fumihiko Sueki, and he has a fantastic work called From the Other to the Dead, which I'll cite in the show notes, and it discusses how death and the dead are the ultimate capital O other. They are contradictorily the most distant other imaginable because they exist, or maybe don't exist, beyond the farthest reaches of human knowledge and experience. But they are also one of the closest others in that the world we live in is determined entirely by the actions and experiences of those who have passed on. Tradition, infrastructure, culture, religion, all of this exists in the manner that it does in the present day due to the actions and achievements of those who have died. Similarly, it is possible to interpret all of human activity among the living as an attempt to relate with death and with the dead. We, the living, exist in their world, not ours. And everything we do in that world is our singular and or collective attempt to understand, interpret, and operationalize the meaning and significance of death, the dead, and the world of the dead that we live in. This is the most frustrating of our human endeavors because while the living can change opinions and interpretations and thought processes, the dead cannot argue amongst themselves, nor can they be argued with. Dead will always be dead. Death and the fact that people die and are dead permanently is perhaps one of the only, if not the only concrete, inviolable, and unchanging reality we know of in this human experience. This is then related with the Buddha and Bodhisattvas, where Fumihiko argues that Mahayana Buddhism, unlike in his interpretation of Theravada, calls upon us to interpret and understand the Buddha himself as dead and gone. We can look to Nietzsche to see a similar discussion in the Christian context, where he argues that the Christian God is dead and we have killed him. In Buddhism, according to Fumihiko, the Buddha is dead, and that is why the texts step into his place, and these texts teach us to walk the Bodhisattva path, which he argues is the path of relating with the dead. It is an extremely fascinating work, and I highly recommend that people read it, and it can be applied to Pretas. Pretas are one of the ways in which human beings relate with the dead. The Bodhisattva path, wherein you would work to relate with death and the dead by doing rituals for the improvement of their lot, is the Buddha's pursuit of defeating death, which is what the Buddha himself did, because in Buddhism, death can be killed. This is not the pursuit of immortality, but it is the pursuit of expanding human knowledge and experience to and beyond the constraints of human life, and in this case, even death.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of Pretas in Buddhism. Join us next week where we will discuss demons in Buddhism. What are demons in Buddhism? What is their status in the canon? How ought we understand them? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this is Med Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.